Pretty interesting article here by Danny Haifong, who is a frequent contributor at the Black Agenda Report as well. Titled Democracy Now! Amplifies State Department Propaganda Campaign Against China Behind Progressive Cover. I think this is just important to point out because in a lot of ways I think Democracy Now! Does some pretty decent work overall, but there are some areas where their coverage is a little bit lacking or a little bit biased. And I think their coverage of China with regards to the, supposed, Uyghur genocide is definitely off the mark. And Haifong in this article points that out. While Democracy Now! Hosts U.S. government-funded pundits to spread humanitarian interventionist propaganda about Xinjiang, an analysis by the Gray Zone found most of the outlets' China coverage is sharply negative. The U.S. has claimed a humanitarian responsibility to protect, to justify military operations in the name of saving civilians from evil dictators. Most notable have been the brutal U.S.-led wars in Libya and Syria, which destabilized entire regions in the name of civilian protection and promoting democracy, which again is still very much happening in Syria, unfortunately. And Libya has become more or less a failed state after the U.S.-led war and intervention there. Literally have open-air slave markets in that country because of what the U.S. has done there. These operations relied heavily on self-described human rights NGOs and media outlets to support among liberal sectors the U.S. intelligentsia. Love that word, intelligentsia. Sadly, Democracy Now! Has been among the most influential and insidious outlets carrying water for the humanitarian interventionist agenda. Not a good look. Not a good look, Democracy Now! What's going on, Amy Goodman? Come on. Flagship program, the left-wing Pacifica Radio Network, Democracy Now! And its founding host, Amy Goodman, are regarded as standard bearers of grassroots progressivism. However, in recent years, the show has become a reliable platform for uncritical regime change propaganda. Again, they've had this nut job on, Adrian Zenz, as this article also points out, China detaining millions of Uyghurs? Serious problems with claims by U.S.-backed NGO and far-right researcher led by God against Beijing. That's who they've platformed him as well on Democracy Now! Fuck. For uncritical regime change propaganda, demonizing targets to U.S. empire from Syria to Nicaragua while sending a correspondent to embed with U.S.-backed rebels in Libya. Jesus. Now that China is in the crosshairs of the U.S., DN is playing host to virtually any piece of humanitarian agitprop that Washington can conjure up while publishing a regular serving of sharply negative stories about Chinese government and society. Viewed by the Gray Zone of every China-related report, an interview Democracy Now! Aired in the past year found that 3 out of every 4 painted China in a decidedly negative light, often echoing narratives emanating from the U.S. State Department. Never to the exponential degree a good look to be carrying water for the fucking U.S. State Department. Democracy Now! Get the fuck out of here. Perhaps its most inflammatory and factually questionable report appeared this Friday amid an escalating wave of anti-China propaganda. Democracy Now! Amps up Cold War fever, dubious cast of U.S. government-sponsored guests. On February 4th, DN aired a story on the latest moral outrage out of China's Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region. It was a report from the BBC, the British Foreign Office-funded media giant that was exposed by the Grey Zone as a UK intelligence contractor. Instead of questioning the BBC's report, which appeared custom-tailored to generate public support for the new Cold War, not nude, Democracy Now! Uncritically amplified it. DN's story opened up with the BBC's interview of Tersani Zaiwudan, the singular source for accusations of mass rape in so-called re-education camps in Xinjiang. And I believe this Tersani individual at first wasn't even claiming this. So let's get into this. Democracy Now! Repeated the US-based exile's claim as fact without any investigation into the credibility of the source. Zawudin is no stranger to the Western press. In fact, prior interview with Zawudin revealed several glaring inconsistencies that placed her credibility as a source into question. Zawudin was first interviewed by a human rights organization in Kazakhstan called Atajert. The group possesses no formal website or information about donors, only social media accounts. In 2018, directors of Atajert junketed to D.C. to meet with National Endowment for Democracy, various anti-China influencers. Again, the NED, National Endowment for Democracy, is basically a CIA-funded cutout working on various regime change operations all over the globe. Neither Zawudin's interview with this organization nor her testimony to the CIA-created Radio Free Asia mention a rape at all. In a feature with BuzzFeed in February 2020, Zawudin stated, I wasn't beaten or abused. The hardest part was mental. It's something I can't explain. You suffer mentally. Being kept someplace and forced to stay there for no reason. You have no freedom. You suffer. Okay, that's understandable, but again, no mention of this rape allegation. Kind of interesting. Seems like their story is changing, right? Zawudin's reflection on her experience changed character after she became involved with the Uyghur Human Rights Project. The UHRP was created and is funded by the National Endowment for Democracy, U.S. intelligence pass-through that was established under the watch of former CIA Director William Casey. The Gray Zone exposed the Uyghur Human Rights Project as part of a consortium of groups operating under the World Uyghur Congress, WC umbrella, and funded to the tunes of tens of millions of dollars a year in U.S. government money to promote the narrative of a Uyghur genocide carried out by China's government. September 2020, the UHRP resettled Zawudin in the U.S., flying her from Kazakhstan to the D.C. area. Ms. Toursani is a critical witness, the U.S. government-funded organization declared in a press release. Her testimony will be vitally important for future atrocity crimes determination processes and tribunals. In a CNN report based on her contradictory claims alleging a Chinese policy of systemic rape, her Chinese passport briefly appeared on screen. It showed that after all of her alleged travails, she was granted a 10-year visa to travel abroad as she pleased. Yet CNN reported she walked across the Kazakh border in 2019, creating the impression she had escaped from China to tell her horror story. In a subsequent broadcast of its report, CNN blurred out Zawudin's passport issue date. Look at that. Carl Zod on Twitter. So Chinese government subjected her to systemic gang rape, forced sterilization, and then issued her a 10-year passport so she could travel abroad to tell CNN. Got it. Makes a lot of sense, right? Democracy Now! Did not mention Zawudin's apparent recruitment by the U.S. government, her dramatically shifting story and its coverage. Instead, it invited a cast of guests from Washington's anti-China echo chamber on to discuss their story. Among them was so-called linguist Abdul Weli Ayub, who spent 2 years in the U.S. as a state fellow for the Ford Foundation and has interviewed more than half a dozen times in Radio Free Asia. Again, a front for the CIA. U.S. regime change, our U.S. government propaganda network funded by the CIA. Ayub's biography was published in a lengthy report by the Uyghur Human Rights Project, the same NED-backed organization would help Toursani Zawudin resettle in the U.S. U.S. academic Darren Blyler rounded out Democracy Now!'s panel on the BBC report. Blyler is a fellow at the Wilson Center, a D.C.-based think tank funded by the U.S. Congress, U.S. Embassy, the United Arab Emirates, and a host of Wall Street banks, including Bank of America, J.P. Morgan Chase. Former U.S. Attorney General and CIA Director David Petraeus and BP share important counsel positions for the org. Blyler is a regular source of quotes advancing U.S. government's Cold War posture against China. So again, you see a theme here. The only people Democracy Now! Seems to be having on to talk or discuss China with are people who have a very strong anti-China rhetoric and worldview, and that's getting parroted on Democracy Now! With no apparent pushback by Amy Goodman or any of the other hosts that are on Democracy Now! And that should be pretty appalling for a so-called left-wing, progressive, independent media outlet, right? He framed Beijing's counterterrorism policy in Xinjiang as a political military equivalent of the U.S. post-war 9/11 on terror, omitting the historical context of dozens of documented mass casualties by the separatist al-Qaeda affiliation known as the East Turkestan Islamic Front in the region between the years of 1990 and 2016. He was even quoted in an article by the State Department-funded Coda story attacking the gray zone alongside U.S. government-sponsored anti-China pundits. In an email to Democracy Now! Staff requesting a comment on its relentless parade of anti-China coverage and steady stream of dubious government sponsored guests went unanswered. You wonder why? I mean, if they could answer for this, I feel like they would, but they can't. So that's why there's crickets. And from my perspective, the silence on Democracy Now! About this article is deafening. Content analysis. 76% of Democracy Now!'s China coverage is sharply negative. Not a good look. And I mean, I wonder if they cover, any of the good stuff that's happening in China. Like this year, they eliminated extreme poverty in the country. That is a massive positive accomplishment that should not go uncovered, obviously. Democracy Now!'s coverage of China over the past year has been almost entirely negative. A content analysis by the Gray Zone of DN Headlines, directly referring to China from February 1st, 2020 to present, reveals that 54 out of 69, 78%, presented a sharply negative spin on events. The vast majority of the stories focused on human rights in Hong Kong and Xinjiang, echoing narratives generated by the U.S. national security state. Some emanated directly from hardline Trump administration officials like Mike Pompeo and John Bolton. Not good, DN, not good. The other 15 DN stories could be considered neutral in tone. They centered on developments surrounding the COVID-19 pandemic. Even here, DN bias towards China stood out. For example, in a headline about a small outbreak of COVID in China in April 2020, DN editors placed scare quotes around the word imported in order to cast doubt on Beijing's claim that the virus originated abroad. Meanwhile, the outlet has offered nothing but praise to the pro-U.S. government of Taiwan's successful pandemic response. And then here we go. Fucking this Adrian Zen's right-wing Christian fanatic nut job. While DN appears to have deemed the U.S. Cold War-style policies toward China as unworthy of criticism, the flagship progressive program found time to host the so-called Xinjiang expert Adrian Zenz in 2019. Zenz, a far-right Christian fundamentalist, member of the Victims of Communism Memorial Fund, who claims to be led by God against the Communist Party of China, is an odd guest for a supposedly left-wing program. No shit, right? Platforming this motherfucker? How about you have Danny Haifong on? Maybe to balance it out a little. I mean, Jesus Christ. An analysis of Zen's research paper accusing China of forced sterilization and genocide, the Gray Zone's Gareth Porter and Max Blumenthal found wanton manipulation of data, major errors, and a number of missing footnotes. Despite his clear credibility issues, Zenz is without question the most cited source in the UN and the West on all matters related to Xinjiang, even though his work has been discredited completely and he's just a far-right Christian fundamentalist and he has huge issues with China. Democracy Now! Provided Zenz a platform despite the fact his most constantly repeated claim that over millions of Uyghurs are being detained in concentration camps was based on a mere 2 sources. A total of 8 interviews conducted by the NED-backed, again that's the National Endowment for Democracy, CIA cutout, Washington, D.C. based network of Chinese human rights defenders, and a single television report from a Turkish-based Uyghur exile organization. Under the Trump national security doctrine, which has been largely largely retained by the Biden admin, the U.S. proclaimed China and Russia to be the greatest threats it faced on the global stage. The truth is that China's emphasis on poverty alleviation, multilateral cooperation, and economic growth, coupled with its growing political independence, is seen as an existential threat to the U.S.'s continued hegemony. As the U.S. charts a dangerous course towards war with China, authentically independent investigative journalism and activism is required to prioritize peace over access to the powerful. Unfortunately, while Democracy Now! Has marketed itself as the exception to the rulers, it's functioning as little more than a force multiplier of the State Department, amplifying Cold War narratives on China behind progressive cover. Here's Danny Haifong. I also highly recommend this book that he co-wrote along with Robert Servant, American Exceptionalism and American Innocence. Really good, really good. And check out his work at the Black Agenda Report as well. He's a frequent writer, contributor there. But I mean, even if you're getting your news from so-called progressive independent media source like Democracy Now!, they're still parodying the fucking U.S. State Department, and 76% of their coverage through the content analysis that the Gray Zone did portrayed China in a negative light, when in fact they're doing some really amazing things. I mean, for God's sakes, they eliminated extreme poverty in their country, a country of, I don't know, was it over a fucking billion people. They got rid of extreme poverty. That is a huge, massive accomplishment. And yet, most of the coverage of China is negative, and that needs to be called out. And again, I think Democracy Now! Not wanting to engage or talk about how this coverage of China has been so negative on their part is quite revealing. And it seems like they do have kind of an agenda they're trying to push, and it's in support of the Cold War, in support of the U.S. State Department narrative. They're holding water for the U.S. fucking State Department and their anti-China zeal. It's disgusting, and Democracy Now! Should be ashamed of themselves. And shame on you, Amy Goodman, for having people like fucking Adrian Zenz platforming that fucking douchebag. I mean, Jesus Christ, what the fuck? Not good. Like the video if you like the damn video. Subscribe for more content. Peace. Much love. All part of the people.